Whenever I visit a museum or exhibit, I examine everything as if I could take one piece home. I do this whether I'm alone or with my children, strolling with friends, or lecturing to students, and this habit encapsulates the principles guiding my research and teaching for 2 decades. At its core, all my work is modeled on museums, movies, and other exhibitionary sites of art and public culture for how they use aesthetics to spark individual interest and social connection.
Film scholar Karen Feng joins me. She literally wrote the book on the subject called John Woo's A Better Tomorrow. I wonder how John Woo was different from the others.
Yeah, so as I said, first of all, there was this kind of the sort of themes of the storyline, this emphasis upon honor and loyalty among the male characters. There's also a style, a distinct visual style to Woo's action cinema. And so now in Hollywood, they talk about the Woo shot, this kind of rack focus between a very quick rack focus, changing in depth perception from in the camera lens from one character to another, that indicates their sort of emotional connection and the attention by which they're looking at things. He tends to he's very much a filmmaker's filmmaker. He's very self-conscious about his film references, and so this sort of there's a lot of double-barreled action with the male characters having guns in both hands that he's borrowing from westerns. John Woo, as a director, had trained, apprenticed in the Hong Kong cinema, working on Flying Swordsman films, the wuxia films that had been important in Chinese language cinema in the 50s and the 60s. And so these themes of honor and loyalty, he sort of borrows from this older genre of the Flying Swordsmen, which are set in this sort of remote medieval past, and he places them in urban Hong Kong, essentially replacing the swords of the past Chinese language cinema with the guns of the Hollywood Western and the Hollywood action.
Today, Art and Survival. The University of Houston presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. I'm Karen Feng at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
I've been fascinated by surveillance, I think, for a long time. I think we now live in an age of mass surveillance. One of the main ideas that I have in Arresting Cinema is this idea that Hong Kong has cultivated like an intense and dynamic surveillance culture that not only is, I would say, sort of like degrees more intense and visible and experiential in Hong Kong and in the cinema than arguably in comparison to Western culture or Western models, but also that in Hong Kong and in the cinema, we frequently see surveillance portrayed in a kind of benign or even benevolent light. So if you think about the sort of Hollywood or the Western tradition, we tend to always see surveillance as something that's sort of a practice of suspicion or critique. Right, so Rear Window, Man with the Movie, Modern Times, right, and starting from the 1950s, I point out in Hong Kong, the 1950s is a time of tremendous urban growth in Hong Kong, right, because after the war and the sort of movements on the mainland, there's this sort of growth in Hong Kong, and so you have all of the sort of the early tenements that we all identify with as sort of like this classic Hong Kong sort of space. And so you have all of these people sort of living in these tenements, often, subdividing apartments, renting out rooms within rooms, right? The sort of bed cage type housing where people can't even afford, even spaces within rooms, but they're rented like these cage-like style lockers, right? That all begins in the 1950s. But if you watch these Cantonese social realism films from the 1950s, you often see this idea of neighborly cooperation, right, as being the means by which the working class, there's often sort of like exile, emigre, often, people coming from very difficult circumstances, while like the close proximity in which they live is a sign of their poverty, it becomes rehabilitated as a form of cooperation and cooperative sustenance as well. One of the reasons why Asian women, are often seen are seen as sort of like highly sexualized, is not only because there's this long like material history that validates that, but also because in sort of like, heteronormative long-standing notions of what is considered like attractive in Western discourse, right? Like thin, small, soft-spoken, hairless, right? All of those attributes that are like have been like valorized as sexually attractive in the global media, right, are attributes that Asian women, phenotypically fulfill, right? So when you lump in sort of historical legacies, phenotypic attributes, right? A population for cultural and demographic and legal reasons who don't seek, who don't fight back and seek representation and or are seen to be as such, and a geopolitical discourse that also corroborates that, right? It's very difficult, you can imagine, to see Asian women as not, outside of that stereotype that's being presented. And so that's sort of, those are the predecessors for the moment that we're in today. If you haven't seen Pam's amazing, wonderful, award-winning movie about Tyrus, Tyrus was an immigrant artist who was instrumental in the making of Disney's classic film, Bambi. So we're going to talk today about his remarkable life and artistic career, in which a Chinese immigrant facing a fierce American anti-immigration policy transcended that to go on and shape some of America's most beloved imagery. But what I love about your clip is that it also includes the Angel Island poetry, right? The detainees carved on the walls. And so it sort of, it hints at the person that Tyrus would become, that he wasn't broken by being a 9-year-old boy separated by his father. He spent a month alone in Angel Island. But, like the poetry around him, he was able to find strength and expression in art. Tyrus, back in the back offices of In-Betweenings, thinks that he has an idea, right? And what's so wonderful about his story is that he solves the problem by effectively sort of sneaking in Chinese painting, right? Because he realizes that this project, the natural world of Bambi's forest, right, is not something that needs to be rendered with the detail and fiddliness, right, of a fairy tale castle, right? The natural world needs to be evoked by feeling and emotion, because that's the world of the animals, right? And so Tyrus literally imports, right, the traditions of Chinese painting into commercial art, right? The very Hollywood milieu that is so engaged in like stereotyping them or just collaborating and keeping Asians invisible altogether, right? And so I think this really encapsulates the sort of power of Tyrus's story, that when the US wanted to make Asians invisible, not only did he refuse that invisibility, he embraced visibility by using his art. We should all strive for excellence and ambition, right? We should all try to make things useful, and we should all be engaged. We should only do things that we're engaged in, right? So I like to give people the option of doing some kind of creative final project that serves you in terms of your studies, in terms of your professional goals. At the end of the school year, we run the student prize competition where you can enter something like what you did in the optional creative final project. And the prize money is $500. It goes on your resume or your portfolio when you start looking for jobs. The previous jury members, in the past, jury members included a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts, a startup founder who sold his companies to Google and Amazon, and the head of the Houston Film Commission. So it's pretty high profile exposure as well. The Student Prize competition that we are celebrating today is another inaugural initiative, and something of which I am especially proud. Our students study and work in so many different kinds of media that a mere film competition would not be sufficient.
I love it when students use their personal interest as a means of developing their skills and critical thinking. These same interests guide my research and teaching, inspire curiosity, and bridge the gap between the academy and general audiences. As a humanist working in visual culture, I'm devoted to celebrating the accomplishments that make us human.